Chris Carter here on the Wednesday edition of the North Shore Drive podcast. Big news, the Steelers have traded away George Pickens. We react to all of it right here on the North Shore Drive podcast with Ray Fittipaldo. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm Chris Carter. He's Ray Fittipaldo. We're your Steelers writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. They can help you out if you're injured in an accident or if you ever need help with workers' compensation. Call 1-800-94-EDGAR today. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, what an explosive Wednesday morning we have here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As George Pickens is traded away to the Dallas Cowboys, we now have the full compensation story here. The Steelers are receiving a third-round pick and a fifth-round pick from the Dallas Cowboys in the 2026 NFL Draft. The Cowboys are receiving George Pickens and a sixth-round pick from the Steelers. So essentially, the Steelers are getting a third-round pick, and they're moving from a sixth to a fifth-round pick. So they'll have two fifth-round picks next year, and then a compensatory sixth-round pick. Actually, three fifth-round picks now that I think about it, because they'll have a compensatory fifth and then two natural fifth-round picks. On top of that, Ray, before I dive in on this, what's your reaction to this move? What does it mean for the Steelers' plans moving forward?
Yeah, I think big picture. Let's look at that first.
Yeah,
it continues to be all about getting a quarterback in 2026, Chris. They want to have enough ammunition to go get a quarterback if they are in position to do that. And, you know, the fact that they were willing to wait on a George Pickens trade after the draft, you know, they did. A lot of people thought, you know, they'll deal him during the draft. If they don't, they'll hang on to him. But as it turns out, they're fine with getting 2026 compensation for him because that syncs up with their long-term building plan. So that's my first gut reaction. This is something they wanted to do to get in a position to get a quarterback in 2026.
I mean, that does make sense if you're adding up for ammunition. Ray, there were rumors that there was potentially a trade, you know, the Steelers could have gotten for George Pickens before the NFL draft. What do you think this is more about? They wanted a higher compensation and maybe the Cowboys weren't willing to come up for George Pickens, and now that they were, or do you think this was, hey, they were less focused on this year's draft and more focused on getting picks for next year's draft?
Yeah, I think it could be twofold, right? I think the Steelers definitely are focused on 2026, and you know the possibility is that the Cowboys wanted to keep their picks in this draft, and they just put this off, you know, for a week or so both parties could be happy. So, you know, I think that's the way that it probably went down. And when you look at it from, you know, a team building perspective, and I'm talking about team building for 2025, Chris, you are trading away a super talented receiver, but you are eliminating a big distraction in that locker room. And I think that was a big part of this. I think he became a cancer in that locker room. I think the coaching staff and the front office realized that. You're probably going to bring in Aaron Rodgers to work with a bunch of new guys. And I think they just wanted to, you know, do the so-called addition by subtraction. And I think in the end, yes, you are losing a guy who was going to produce numbers for you. But just in the team perspective, you know, symmetry in the locker room, I think this is going to go a long way towards making a lot of players in that locker room happier because they don't have to deal with George Pickens and all the distractions that he brings.
Well, let's talk about that. How much of a cancer is George Pickens? He was the Steelers' top weapon on offense last year, and we saw once he was out of the lineup, the offense severely struggled to move the ball, and it became a whole problem at the end of the season. And granted, yeah, we saw times where he was crashing out. He was late to the Christmas Day game. He was crashing at the end of the Christmas Day game. He gets into fights with Browns players, and there's questions about his attitude. Last year he didn't throw that block for Jaylen Warren, and the Steelers were trying to get it. Was this maybe just like, hey, the Steelers had enough, and this is along the lines of what they did with Santonio Holmes back in 2010, I think it was, and Antonio Brown back in the end of 2019 going into that season?
Yeah, I think it was a culmination of everything that happened. And, our fans should check out postgazette.com later on today. Brian Bacco is going to do a timeline of everything that George Pickens did throughout his career, during his 3 seasons. And, you mentioned, like, to me, the eye black and, acting out in that way, that's one thing. You mentioned not blocking for Jaylen Warren. That's the type of stuff that really irritates other professionals in that locker room, because it's supposed to be all about the team. And when you're out there giving half what effort and not blocking for your teammates, that's the type of stuff that gets you in trouble in the locker room. So those guys had no respect for George Pickens because of stuff like that. You don't study the playbook enough to run the right route. I know there's been a lot of talk about that Christmas Day game against the Chiefs. A lot of people still are putting that on Russ. He shouldn't have thrown the ball. Well, that's true, but George Pickens also didn't occupy the safety and allowed that safety to get over the top to jump that route as well. So when you're not doing everything you can to help the football team win, I think that really bothers players, and I think that was a big issue in that locker room for the last couple of years, not just last season.
And look, we've heard from guys like, I remember, not just last year, but the year before, there have been guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt being like, everyone has to buy in. And no one would say George Pickens by name, but a lot of the reporters were kind of like looking over and be like, well, is that the guy who's not buying in? Because there were assumptions about that, and there were rumors that floated around. And great, again, the Steelers players themselves wouldn't pin that on George, but there were a lot of people who said, like, hey, this is where the problem is. He's not always on time. When everyone's toe is on the line to do a drill, his toe wasn't always there. Now, supposedly after the Jaylen Warren situation in 2023, when that happened, Mike Tomlin had words with him, and he straightened out, and he was fine for the rest of the year. But he was supposed to maintain that all of 2024, and clearly that wasn't the case. And look, George Pickens is a phenomenal athlete. He's a very talented wide receiver. But like you said, Steelers have done this before. They did this to Santonio Holmes, who literally was like a year and a half removed from being the Super Bowl MVP that caught one of the greatest catches in the history of football, let alone Steelers history, in the Super Bowl, to give them their 6th Super Bowl trophy. Antonio Brown was traded away for. I think technically this would be more, because I think they just got a third as 6th, and this was a third in a pick swap. But still, for similar compensation, and he was the best receiver in football for 6 straight years. So like that's. The Steelers have done this before. So this isn't outside of their blueprint, but I do think it is certainly a big shakeup. I want to talk to you more, Ray, about the overall grand scale of this and what this means for the Steelers moving forward, because the other aspect of this means now you have the guys that were the starting quarterback, the guy that Kevin Colbert picked to be the starting quarterback, the guys that you signed to be the starting quarterback, the guys that you drafted to be the top running back, and the guys you drafted to be the top wide receiver. All the last picks of Kevin Colbert for the offense that was going to drive the moving forward outside of Pat Freiermuth have been shuffled out the organization. Well, I want to talk about the impact of that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Did you also know that they do workers' compensation? When you've been hurt on the job, who decides when you're better? Who decides when your treatment is over? And who decides when your benefits are over? The answer might surprise you. It's the insurance company's doctors. How does that make you feel? If the answer is not great, call Edgar Snyder Associates today at 1-800-94-EDGAR. Remember, they'll fight for your workers' compensation rights that you deserve. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's continue to talk about the impact of the Steelers trading away George Pickens for a 3rd and a 5th round pick. George Pickens and a 6th for a 3rd and a 5th round pick here. let's look at what this offense now looks like, because Ray, I think part of where I was starting to be sold on this, that George Pickens could be part of the plan, was that now you're in a position where DK Metcalf doesn't have to do everything by himself in the passing game as the number one wide receiver. You could have him and Pickens and Freiermuth, and then you have Calvin Austin or Roman Wilson or Scotty Miller or Robert Woods or whoever you wanted to be that third option. And then you had the O-line, and then you had the run game with the dual running back attack that you could have with Caleb Johnson and Jalen Warren. So that was sitting right there for you. And now you trade away George Pickens. Now I do have questions. What is the plan for wide receiver? Is it just that they're going to go back to what they did last year, and maybe they're just trying not to throw the ball that much? What's your outlook on them now basically going back to where they were last year with a bona fide wide receiver one, and then a bunch of guys who you're not sure if they can be wide receiver two?
Yeah, I think that's the second biggest storyline to come out of this trade. They are pretty much back to square one. And, how are you going to devise a game plan around DK Metcalf and then a bunch of other guys? Not to put those guys all in one bunch, but they like Roman Wilson, but Roman Wilson was injured. They like Calvin Austin, but I don't think anyone in that organization thinks he's a viable number two. And then you mentioned other guys. You got your Ben Skoronix, your Scotty Millers, your Robert Woods. All those guys aren't projecting, as a number two receiver. So, you look out, are the Jets going to move on from Allen Lazard? That would be perfect if the Steelers got Aaron Rodgers. I think the Jets, if they wanted to make that move, if they wanted to release him or trade him for a late round pick, the Steelers could get somebody like Allen Lazard, who's 29 years old, to come in and maybe be that number two just for 1 year until you could restock your receiving core. But I think in the end, it's going to be about all those guys who are in the room now. And I think if you want to look at one guy who has a chance to step up, and I'm not saying be a number two, but have a chance to step up and be a big part of the offense, I would say that guy is Roman Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, he's a big question mark right now. He was a third-round pick last year, and he never saw the field. Granted, that was because he dealt with an injury, and there were a lot of things that played into that. But they need him and or Calvin Austin to step up now. And the addition of Robert Woods was this year's Allen Robinson or Van Jefferson.
Right.
That to me was never like that was just hey, we're just adding the veteran to the room. And maybe that was the move they did because they knew that this was coming down the line, because they were like, hey, we're probably going to get this offer from the Cowboys, and then we'll probably take it there. Right. But to me, you gotta have something in line there because. I thought that there were it made sense if you're going to say, hey, we don't have a quarterback to pay big money right now, so we can have an extra position somewhere where we're padding ourselves a little bit. We have more talent. They've already signed DK Metcalf to a very expensive contract. At the time when they signed it, you and I wondered, hey, does that mean George Pickens is gone? Then the whole draft process came and went. And it was like, okay, so I guess it's not the case. But now here they are, and he is gone. And so that to me shows a big question there as far as how this process is played out. I also wonder here, Ray, whereas this probably doesn't impact the Steelers standing on wanting to get Aaron Rodgers, do you think it'll impact Aaron Rodgers standing about wanting to be with the Pittsburgh Steelers?
No, I'm sure that came up in the 8-hour meeting that they had when Aaron came in, or in the subsequent phone conversations. We know that, Mike and Aaron have kept in contact, throughout this process. So I am sure Aaron is not blindsided by this. I'm sure he knew it was a possibility. I'm sure the Steelers explained to him why that was. I think Aaron probably has a pretty good picture of the problems that George caused, both for the locker room and for the coaching staff. So I really view this as two separate entities, right? Aaron Rodgers is going to come or he's not going to come. And whatever the Steelers did with George Pickens was going to be completely separate from anything that had to do with that.
Here's another thought here. Omar Khan was able to get a second-round pick for Chase Claypool during the season. Why not wait until you get a compensation like that for middle part of the season? Because, again, you could use George Pickens this year a little bit and then still get this trade compensation during the season when someone gets desperate for a wide receiver because they feel like they're on the cusp and they're saying, hey, we just need that guy, and then you could drive up the price a little bit. Or was it simply, hey, that extra draft compensation would be nice, but we needed to get George Pickens out of here because he was too much of a problem?
I think it's probably that, although you do have to look back at Chase Claypool. Even though he had his own problems, he wasn't the problem that George Pickens was. Also, he had, when they traded him at the deadline, he had a year and a half left on his contract, not just
true.
1 year. So if you want to project that out, is that worth a little bit more in terms of compensation? Yeah, maybe that is the case. But you were probably right. I think it just got to a stage where it was untenable for the Steelers to deal with him. If you want to look at predict what was the last straw for the Steelers, probably showing up late, 45 minutes before the game against Kansas City on Christmas Day. If they weren't convinced at that point, they probably were convinced by that. But I mean, Chris, there's so many things that happened before that as well that I'm sure that was just the icing on the cake.
I'm sure it didn't help his case because I think that this was the year to I think this was the year for George Pickens to prove that this was the guy that he was more mature, to say that, hey, I've grown up a bit, and he obviously didn't show that. And so the Steelers were like, you know what, we're not sticking around to wait for this any longer. We're gonna make this move and get this draft compensation for him next year. And again, it goes to the whole they're gonna trade up and get a quarterback thing, which I think gets louder and louder with every month that we talk about it.
How do you think he's going to handle being number 2 to CD Lamb?
It's a good question.
How's he going to get paid in Dallas?
That's a great question. And that's the other thing. I don't know. I get this. This might just be Jerry Jones just going all in and saying, you know what, we're doing it, because I don't think the Cowboys have enough money to pay him, because they're paying Dak Prescott huge money right now. I'm pulling up their salary cap numbers, because that is a good question. What are the Cowboys going to do with this? Because looking at the Cowboys, the NFC East, there's the Dallas Cowboys. So their current cap space has $34.5 million for this year. So, I mean, George Pickens this year wasn't going to be the problem, but next year they dropped down to $10.4 million in cap space. Dak Prescott is a $74 million cap hit. CeeDee Lamb, a $38.6 million cap hit. Now, granted, they could probably move money around and say, hey, we're going to move this around, but that would be a lot of money that you'd be sinking into the wide receiver position to make CeeDee Lamb one of the highest paid wide receivers in the league, and then to also sign George Pickens, which means maybe the Steelers did just get a third-round pick for a year rental of George Pickens.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's strange when you look at it on the surface, because there have been plenty of dysfunctional situations in Pittsburgh with receivers, but now you're going to Dallas, where the media is even crazier. I mean, that's like playing in New York.
Yeah.
Okay? He's going to be number 2 to CeeDee Lamb. How does he handle that? Like the targets. Like, to me, that's going to be fascinating. It's going to be the topic of all the morning TV shows and all that. So it's going to be fascinating to see that, how that unfolds for Dallas throughout the course of the season.
It certainly will. I want to talk about other things the Steelers can do now that George Pickens is gone. Will they sign a free agent wide receiver? We'll talk more about that and other part of their plans here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, remind you, this show is also brought to you by UFC Gym. Looking for a way to challenge your body and sharpen your mind? Step into something more than just a workout. Welcome to the brand new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy at UFC Gym. Here, it's not just about training. It's about living the values of honor, discipline, and respect. Whether you're a total beginner or leveling up your skills, you'll be guided through a structured program led by a third-degree black belt that builds confidence, strength, flexibility, and real technique. Head down to the UFC Gym at the Waterfront or Market Square to learn about the exclusive 3-month introductory package today at UFC Gym Pittsburgh. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, there are still free agent wide receivers out there right now. Keenan Allen's still out there. Amari Cooper's still out there. Do you foresee the Steelers making a move to sign one of those guys, or are they just going to rock out with who they got right now?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I think a lot of that will depend on, Aaron Rodgers has a type for receivers, right? So, he likes his receivers to be very disciplined and detailed. So I wouldn't be surprised at all, Chris, if the Steelers wait till Aaron Rodgers signs, and then, these guys are out there in May. They're probably going to be out there in June, and then you go from there because it has to be the right fit for Aaron Rodgers. If you go out and get somebody who on paper has better stats or, put up good numbers in different situations, it really doesn't matter. I mean, it's funny. Like you look back at when Tom Brady went to the Buccaneers, and Tom Brady did this throughout his career, but he made Scotty Miller look really good in those couple of seasons, right? I mean, Scotty Miller had that huge touchdown in that playoff game that helped the Tampa Bay Buccaneers get to the Super Bowl. So sometimes, quarterbacks just develop relationships and chemistry with receivers of, differing talent level. And sometimes I don't want to say you can get away with having less talent, but sometimes it just happens that way. Like Scotty Miller can just develop. You remember with Ben Roethlisberger,
Eli Rogers.
Mm-hmm. Like who would have thought an undrafted free agent like Eli Rogers would come in and would be like a security blanket for Ben? But that's the way it unfolded. So to me, that might happen down the road, Chris. But I don't think it's going to happen until we know what's going on with Aaron Rodgers.
You mean Aaron Rodgers would demand a specific wide receiver for the Steelers to get? No, that couldn't happen. He's never done that before.
That's why I brought up Lazard. Listen, Lazard, I think he's got 2 years left on his contract. Like one of those is a void year, but like his base salary for this season is like $2.5 million. The Jets have already paid out the bonuses. So if you could deal like a 6th or 7th round pick to make Aaron Rodgers happy, if Aaron Rodgers comes, I think that's a move they can likely make in June or July to make him happy.
I mean, that would kind of make sense. I still don't think Allen Lazard would be a legitimate wide receiver too, but maybe he's just Aaron's guy, like you're saying, and that's just another body to add to the room. I hear that. I could see that. And ultimately, whoever you're signing is a 1-year rental wide receiver. Like you're not signing, Keenan Allen or Amari Cooper to be to be your star number 2 wide receiver for, next to DK Metcalf long term. I ask you this though, Ray, thinking back a little bit, does this make not drafting a wide receiver a mistake in your eyes? Because I'm not saying in the first round or even the 3rd round. I get those moves. You needed to strengthen your trenches. You got a running back in the fold, and now you have a running back for the future. But that 4th round pick of Jack Sawyer, which I was like, okay, good depth for the edge rusher position. But if you had traded and gotten, or not traded, if you had just drafted like Iamaleava or Kyle Williams, I don't know all the receivers that were fully available at that stage of the 4th round off the top of my head. But if you had gotten just a capable guy that you could come in and say, hey, here's our new Roman Wilson or Calvin Austin. Now we got 3 young dudes that we can just throw out there and say, hey, compete, go be the number 2 wide receiver. Is that a mistake in your eyes not to add there? Or was this, it just is like, hey, they've already done that the last few years. So they can just wait to see what happens with those guys.
Yeah, I think in the end, maybe you can make an argument. You get your running back in round 4, you take a receiver in round 3. Like I don't remember who exactly was available. I think at that point, Chris, like Jalen Noel was off the board. I think even Savion Williams was off the board. So, they might have just thought, hey, we don't have a 2nd round pick. DK Metcalf is basically our 2nd round pick this year. We're just going to roll with it. We're going to make it work with Pat Freiermuth. We're going to give some targets to Darnell Washington. We're going to target Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin more. Maybe they just piece it together to the point where they kind of just game plan around the fact that they don't have a true number 2 and just hope it works out better than it worked out last year.
Absolutely, I hear you there. I gotta think that there's another step to this plan right now. But I also think that part of this is the Steelers. They've moved like this before several times. Again, you think of Santonio Holmes and Antonio Brown, even Martavis Bryant when they traded him away for I think that was the pick that they got him for the pick that they used for Mason Rudolph. They do this when they think that, hey, this situation's untenable. He may be a star wide receiver and he might produce right away, but we're going to keep trying to add picks back. And hey, it was the picks that they traded away Santonio Holmes for that they used to help get Emmanuel Sanders and Antonio Brown, and that turned out to be their next wide receivers core. Mason Rudolph is still on the team where Martavis Bryant's not in the league anymore. Chase Claypool, they traded him away. That's Joey Porter Jr. So they've had this system of doing this. It's just, I think the question is, what's going to be the actual payout for this? Will they be able to use this towards getting that franchise quarterback next year? Will they be able to use this to just build a more complete roster next year? I think the thing is that the answers to those questions are still now a year away. Not even this season, but a year away.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to talk about this in the days and weeks to come. But correct me if I'm wrong. 2026 draft for the Steelers right now, you got 3 3s and 3 5s, and I know there's more, but 3 third-rounders, assuming you get a third-round comp pick, and then 3 fifth-rounders. That's pretty good ammunition to move up and to get a quarterback and to fill a lot of holes on your roster that you may have going into that season.
Absolutely. We will have more reactions to this throughout the week. We got Brian back on the Friday podcast. We also, just to let y'all peek behind the curtain, we have an interview with DJ Thomas Jones, the Steelers undrafted free agent fullback who's coming in from South Alabama. He has an amazing story. This was going to be part of the Wednesday episode, but when this happened, we had to push that back. We apologize to him and his people because he has an amazing story that I think all Steelers fans want to check out. That will be on the Friday episode of the North Shore Drive podcast, barring unless Aaron Rodgers wants to sign anytime soon. But hey, that'll happen there. But hey, keep it here for all your Steelers news. Post-Gazette.com for all our written work, and of course the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's podcasting network here on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of this show and all the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.